Checking, checking, checking. August 18th, 1993, our son Jim and I are here in the living room of the house I had the joy of building personally in 1949. This has been our home since that point in time, except for the 2.5 years that we lived in Nashville. It's filled with the most pleasant of memories, of course, and memories related to the rearing of our children, the grandchildren, and it's furnished with antiques which Ellen has been able to find literally in travels from Maine to California. First, let me thank Landrum for making this project possible and providing the resources. Our hope is that the oral history that comes from the taping of our professors emeritus will be of value to people who celebrate the 100th anniversary of the seminary in the future, and possibly in other celebrations as well. I was born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana in 1923, right in the middle of what I later discovered was the Civil War battlefield for the Battle of Baton Rouge, which had been fought in August of 1862. And of course, as an individual, I'm, like everyone, a part of a great stream of people who have contributed to in my and being involved as I am in the ministry and in this particular task. In many ways, I stand on their shoulders because of the contribution that they made, not only in terms of what they gave me and what they provided for me as I grew up, but from the standpoint of the spiritual growth to which they contributed and the development. And so, as I stand on the shoulders of those in the past, I'm part of a stream that flows into the present and then on into the future through our children and through our grandchildren and ultimately through our great-grandchildren. Looking back as far as we can find records, we can find a record of a John Minton who was living in London in the 1200s, and he had married there in one of the churches. The little village of Minton, by the way, is in the edge of the hill country and close to the Welsh border. When Ellen and I were in London, I looked through the telephone book to try to find a bunch of possible kinfolk. Discovered quite a few Minton families, but just recently I discovered that there are only about 4,000 Minton households in the whole world. So I can't figure out whether they were not very prolific or whether or not they had all girls and everybody that was a Minton married somebody and changed their name. But the line of descent from which I have come, these people came to this country in 1800. And they came up the Amite River to the first of the highlands, the higher lands, I should say, here in Louisiana, the first of the terraces, and settled at Denham Springs. Settled right by the springs and homesteaded that land. In fact, that is a part of, now is Old Town Denham Springs, but it was the area where the First Baptist Church was built, and our ancestors had something to do with getting it started. And the back part of the Minton place was given by the family for the city graveyard, and it's there in Minton Street. It goes by the graveyard. But the earliest record we find of Minton's in Denham have to do with Andrew. Then we find Joseph Minton, who was in the Civil War as an infantryman. I believe it was the 9th Louisiana Infantry and the Confederate Army, which he fought. And Joseph had a son named Isaac, and Isaac had a son named John, and John was my daddy. Dad had been born in 1892, and on the Lockhart side of our family, if you were going back 3 or 4 generations, you would encounter Joel Lockhart. Then Joel had a son named John B. Lockhart, John Benjamin, and he was in the Civil War also, only he had a horse, so he was in the cavalry. If
you had a horse, you could be in the cavalry.
Apparently, if you had a horse, they'd put you in the cavalry.
Are these the two that got captured?
Well, yeah. In a sense, it was John B. and Bill Peake who were captured by the Yankees.
And Peake was a cousin?
Peake? No, Peake was the other side of the Lockhart family. Okay. And Bill Peake and John B. Lockhart, since you asked, were they were coming, I think, from the Battle of Fort Hudson after the Yankees had won the battle. And the story that I heard as a child was that they got to the Ainit River, and the Yankees had a patrol at all the fords of the river, and they caught them and made them prisoners of war and put them to, I don't know how they sent them to New Orleans, maybe down the river, but they put them in prisoner of war camp in the old Mint building, which is there still at the corner of where Esplanade Avenue reaches the river, right in the edge of the port. And they evidently, Bill Peake was a pretty good sneak thief because he stole the chisel out of the blacksmith shop. John B. could play the fiddle, and they concocted a story about some rebel holiday, and so they got a fiddle and made a lot of noise, and they chiseled their way out of there and made their way back to Baton Rouge. And an old aunt of mine has that chisel on a plaque up on the wall in her living room. And of course, an account of the story. And I found a reference to their capture and their escape in some of the books on the Confederacy. But these were men in my background. There's another fellow named James Dallas McDonald on the maternal side of the Minton family. He was a Civil War surgeon in the Confederate Army and was wounded. We don't know where, but it may have been Vicksburg. At least I've heard that it was. And he was sent home and, of course, lived to rear a very large family and to practice medicine in Livingston Parish for well over 50 years after the Civil War. He had a daughter named Brunette, who was called Nettie all her life, Nettie McDonald. She married the son of Joseph Minton, whose name was Isaac, and they were my grandparents on the Minton side. And on the Peake side, the fascinating thing to me is that Bill Peake and John B., when they got out of that prison, a little bit later on, the daughter of Bill Peake married the son of John B. Lockhart, and they became my Lockhart grandparents. And of course, that set up a situation where, when I was coming up, I had so many kinfolk in the immediate family and in the satellite families around our immediate family. I had as many as 20 aunts and uncles. And in those families, I had as many as 50 first cousins. So I did not lack for people to play with or
watch out
nurture and encouragement
right.
During the early part of my life. But these folk are in the background and have contributed to the Christian heritage, which has been mine. I was very fortunate in that Mother and Dad were Christians. Grandpa Ike has helped to start the Baptist church there in Walker. Dad had been church treasurer at one time and was also a Sunday school teacher. Mother was a very quiet person, mainly related to the home and the rearing of the children. She did an awful lot of singing of hymns, I can recall. And she was good at working scriptural truth into ordinary conversation so that we get the point, get the idea. But Mother's life centered around the family, whereas Dad worked at the Standard Oil Company. Beginning in 1915, he helped build the place, physically build it, and then worked with it for about 40 some odd years until he retired in the 50s. And after a few years after he retired, he died of cancer. But he was a part of the industrialization of that area. Let's pause for a moment. In the immediate family in which I was born, I was the oldest boy to survive. Our family included my older sister Mildred, my younger sister Barbara, and my two younger brothers Kenneth and Gary. But these God-fearing people who were in my background contributed to the fact that I was introduced to praying and singing hymns, going to church, revering the Lord almost from the time I was able to be conscious. And this had a strong influence upon me. If we think about these people in the past, and the stream keeps flowing beyond me, thank goodness. As it flows into the future, I think about our children, our son James Lockhart Minton, married Kathy Burns in 1969, and they gave us James Donald Minton, my first grandson, and they also gave us Jenny Leanne Minton and Ken and Joelle Minton, our second granddaughter. Our daughter Donnell married a lawyer, Gary Williams, and they've given us Christopher Ashton Williams and Jeffrey Lockhart Williams and Joshua Williams. Jamie has just gotten married and has given us a new family member, Amy Stower. And there's a potential there for the beginning of family of our great-grandchildren. Of course, that's a great thrill for us to even think about being able to see our great-grandchildren. When we're all together on Sunday having a meal together at the church, there are generally 13 of us all together, with the children bringing their boyfriends and girlfriends. Sometimes we have as many as 18 and 20. So the family moves on, and I suppose that one of the reasons I'm as interested in family as I am is because a large part of my ministry has been involved in family life education. And from the beginning of my life, I've been very conscious of my kin people and of the love that they extended and of the encouragement and of the good times and the value of being part of a family that interacts and works together and prays together and worships together. And so family has meant so much to me in my life that I couldn't put too much emphasis upon the influence that these people have had and the hopes that I have for the future generations. My daddy was a very inventive person. He did not have the benefit of a formal education. I believe if he had, there's very little that he could not have done. He was interested in electricity before electricity became commonly used in the Baton Rouge area. he invented a wrench. I think Daddy got tired of getting crossed up trying to figure which way to turn a crescent wrench to get it to open and close. So he developed a wrench with a dual handle and notches, which is where it could be set and then squeezed together, very much like the squeeze pliers that we have today. He got a patent on it from Washington, where got a lawyer, hired a lawyer, and had a patent on it. But the essential idea was apparently stolen and incorporated in some other wrenches that I've seen since then. But he was an inventive person. He was working on a motor that would have been much more efficient than the motors that existed back in the 20s and the 30s. He was always very encouraging for me in that he, without making a big to-do of it, seemed to inculcate into me a desire to get an education and then to do something that would be productive. I have no doubt but what he and Mother prayed much for me when I was growing up. And I know from personal experience that they prayed me through the war. And I've been very consciously aware of the prayers of my people through the years. And I believe sincerely that even today, the Lord is answering prayers which they said many years ago for me and for my present family. Dad was what was called in those days a first aid instructor. This was a person who learned how to give the first initial medical help to injured persons who had had accidents or calamities. And he became so good at it that he and his team won a number of competitions, and then Daddy was made an instructor and taught other men at the Stand-Off Company how to administer first aid in accident situations. And today they would refer to those people as paramedics, I believe. But Dad was good at that, and no doubt he had been influenced by his grandfather, whom, by the way, he had watched sever the arm of his daddy, Eichmann, after he'd gotten his arm caught in the cotton gin which he owned, and it had been torn and mangled and gangrene set in. And
I remember he'd crawl up in the rafters or something and watch down when they were cutting it off, amputating that arm.
He got on the second floor of the house and looked through the cracks on the floor and watched his grandfather cut his daddy's arm off. But that was in about 1905. And at that time, great-grandpa McDonald was about my age. He was in his 70s when he cut his son-in-law's arm. But Dad had an interest in medicine, and I think that was a strong influence also on me, because I've been interested in the history of medicine all my life, and I've been interested in medicine per se. But over and above and beyond the physical medicine, I've been, throughout life, greatly concerned about the spiritual health of people and emotional health of people. And so it's been the concern for the health and well-being of people that no doubt was influenced greatly by my daddy. He died of cancer, died in my arms. I was trying to revive him when he passed away. I grew up in the times of the good times of the 20s, when Dad was working at the plant, Stand-Off Company, and also owned a grocery store. And as a youngster, I learned my first lessons in honesty, because I got caught stealing candy out of the store. And they taught me right away that you don't take things that don't belong to you. And then the Depression of the 30s came on, and most of us in the Baton Rouge area were not necessarily aware that there was a Great Depression, and certainly not in the sense that it was as widespread as it was, because it seems that we always had what we needed and even had enough to share with people who were less fortunate than we were. Mom always kept food on hand for men who had come to Baton Rouge looking for work, and would come by the house and ask if she had any food she could share. She'd always ask them if they would do a little task around the yard. It would help them feel like they weren't getting a handout. But the Depression years were not as horrible at the time as one would think if we look back on it. I remember the ridiculous prices of things. I could get a haircut for a dime. I could go to the show for a dime. I could get a big Powerhouse candy bar for a nickel. Soft drinks that charged a nickel back in the 20s, instead of charging down to 4 cents and 3 cents and 2 cents, they just kept making bigger bottles. And what we get in a 2-liter bottle today would sell for a nickel back in those days. But things began to get better along about the 30s, in the latter 30s, along about 37, 38, 39. And the aircraft industry began to pick up in California. Men began to be able to go to places like California and get work in the aircraft industry for $5 an hour, which was tremendously high wages at that point in time, because during the late 30s and early 40s, I worked all day as a youngster, an 8-hour shift for $1. And
when you were a soda jerk?
That was one of my first jobs. I had several jobs, but the one I enjoyed the most, I think, was the soda jerking. And I would work at the paste truck store.
Is it still there?
And to my knowledge, it's gone. They cleared that whole area out for a big shopping mall. But that was located very close to where one of the Yankee battalions, Yankee artillery batteries, was located during the Civil War period, I later discovered. But in 1940, I went on, let's cut it off for a minute. I meant to tell you a while ago that Dad was my Sunday school teacher at the Escoma Baptist Church when I was 10 years of age. And I remember very definitely when he and I sat on the old wicker couch. It was velour-covered cushions and wicker on the sides and on the back. We sat on that couch and Dad talked with me about accepting Christ as my Savior, and I did. And I was then baptized later when in the old Emmanuel Baptist Church, which was on Dubrock Street, just past the National Cemetery. But those were days of joy and development. As a child, about that time in my life, I learned to play the guitar and to sing the Western songs that Gene Autry and Roy Rogers, who had just become movie stars at that time, they were singing, and I would hear them sing and try to imitate them. And later on, I would try to imitate the country music songs of a man named Jimmy Rogers, who was the blues yodeler. And with my little voice at that time, I had learned to yodel. And I used to play and sing in churches, in theaters. I remember a time when I sang in the theater there at Denham Springs without knowing anything about my family background and history. But I remember singing with Roy Schaefer from WWL, who came out and fixed up a show, and he still owed me $2 for singing that thing.
Think we should get your guitar out and you know kind of break into a little.
I don't think we should get it out right now, but 1937, I had a little country music band. I don't know whether I ever told you about that or not, but we played on the first radio station in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, about 1937.
Is that where you sang the TB blues at the tuberculosis hospital?
No, that was at another time when I went out to the hospital and didn't have any better understanding of the situation than to do that. But we played on that radio station, and we were sponsored on WJBO by the Hebert Department Store. By the way, Reverend John Hurt and Dr. Ray Brown, who both later became ministers, were members of that little group, along with O.C. Brown, who became, I think, assistant district attorney or district attorney there in Baton Rouge later. But I was a Boy Scout, along with Glenn Bigford and Ralph Germany and the Broomfield Boys and others, and I learned a great deal in the Boy Scout movement that helped me out later on when I entered the service. I was not much of a competitive athlete. One athletic interest I had got knocked out of me right about the place where the Confederate boys crossed into the Yankee camp there across Dufrock Street. I was a heavy little feller at 11 years of age, and heavy for my age, and they put me in the center of the line. In the football, one of the boys from Baton Rouge High came, and he was going to coach us. And they put me in the middle of the line, and some little fella that much stronger and much faster than I knocked me for a loop. And I decided right then I wouldn't have a professional career as a football player. And my track career was ended. We dug a pit and we put a bunch of sawdust in it. And we were going to do high jumps. And of course, not knowing how to do high jumps, I jumped over and landed flat on my little bottom. And for about 3 minutes, I couldn't breathe. And I decided I wasn't going to be an athlete.
And ended that career.
I turned to music. And by virtue of the music, I was in the Estrema high school band playing the tuba and the trombone. And then on the basis of that experience, I had a music scholarship, of all things, a music scholarship at LSU beginning in 1940. And I played in that great 210-piece Tiger marching band. Played the tuba and had great times. I remember some of the trips that we made, many of the games that were played, really a joyful time. While I was at LSU, I was in the PSU movement in the early days of the movement there in Louisiana at LSU. Bob Denny had come in the late 30s, and John Hurt and I had gone out and entertained even while we were high school boys. And then in 1940, G. Avery Lee came, the one who pastored St. Charles Baptist Church for so long there in New Orleans, and who's still active. G. Avery Lee was our PSU director. I'll never forget, he helped me through my first romantic crisis. He did a good job of listening before PSU directors learned to listen. He listened and I suffered, but I managed to survive, and I've always appreciated. And when I entered the ministry years later, the first letter I got was from G.A. Worthing Church. I still have the letter. But he was our PSU director in 1940, and he and I also acted. I don't know whether you knew that or not.
No, I didn't.
We were in the campus theater productions. I had one of the lead roles in a war drama entitled The Moon is Down, about the Nazi invasion of Sweden. And then I played the part of Dr. Einstein in the classic play Arsenic and Old Lace. And G. Avery played the part of son, Jonathan. But I was sort of a mixture of confidence in some areas and a sense of inadequacy in others. And of course, I was in the process of finding myself. My scholastic interest first turned toward chemical engineering. But I got as far as qualitative and quantitative analysis and chemistry, and came to find out that I really did not want to spend my life with a bunch of test tubes in a laboratory. So I went over to the psychology department and asked them if they had some tests a fellow could take to find out what he ought to be in life. Well, they grabbed me real quickly and put me through about a full day of testing. A couple of weeks later, they wrote to my daddy and told him that this young man, well, they described me to a T. And down at the last paragraph, it said, from all of the above, it would appear that this young man should be interested in some form of social work, or possibly the ministry. And when I read that, I thought, at that point in time, I thought these psychologists were crazy. Now I know it. But that was, I went ahead and majored in sociology and minored in radio, which there again, radio keeps cropping up in my background. But I was also a member of F Company in the Reserve Army Officers Training Program at LSU. I put in 2 years in that, and that was great help for me when I volunteered for the Navy Officer Training Program, because I already had that 2 years of training behind me. But in July the 1st, 1943, I was accepted as a volunteer into the Naval Reserve Officer Training Program at Tulane University. And from there, I was shipped to Columbia University for further training in New York City. And then it was while in training, before I was shipped to Columbia, it was while I was in training at Tulane, 50 years, almost to the day of today. It was actually the second Sunday in the month of August of 1943 that I met Ellen Justine Champagne. She was the most beautiful little blonde-headed, blue-eyed girl that I'd ever seen. And I thought of marriage that day, but I thought that surely she was too beautiful and too vivacious to be interested in me. But those negative thoughts didn't last very long, because I began to pursue her and court her rather vigorously, and with considerable zeal. And it was our relationship that nurtured me through many of the lonely hours that I spent overseas when we were waiting to go into action, or when there was no action taking place. I was commissioned as an ensign in April of 1944, and I was assigned to LST, that stands for Landing Ship Tank, LST 742. Some people call us a large, slow target. We couldn't go more than about 10 knots, fully loaded with tanks and personnel carrying people into landings. But and we were quite a target. We made landings in Borneo, New Britain, in the Philippines, and some of our people were getting killed, and we were losing some people. And I realized we had no chaplain, so I went to the captain and spoke to him about it. And he said, "Would you like to be chaplain?" And I said, "Well, we don't have one. I'll be chaplain." So he appointed me chaplain on that ship. And I wrote home, got some song books, 2 books of sermons, and we held services, and I preached. I still have copies of those sermons that I wrote out.
Did you have your guitar with you to sing with the songbook?
I bought a guitar from and we would play it. I bought a guitar from an Australian soldier that we carried into the landing at Tarakan and Borneo. And I gave it away later when I came home and left the ship. I gave it to one of the boys on the ship. But I bought a guitar from him because he was going into the landing and didn't want to carry it ashore with him. I suppose that I became very much aware during that time of the prayers of my people, prayers of our church people. There was a star on a flag in the Eskrima Baptist Church. One of them was marked for me, and I had a picture of it with the star marked, and those people were praying for me. There were several times I was real close to death, real close to being killed. I suppose the most dramatic time was we were cruising in convoy with about 100 other ships, and we were on the port line of ships about 30 back. I had just held services up on the bow of the ship. It was a Sunday morning, 8 o'clock. And I was walking aft on the ship when we heard a tremendous explosion. And looked ahead and realized that one of the ships up ahead had been cut in two by a torpedo and was in the process of just sinking very rapidly. So I ran to my battle station, and I was gunnery officer at that time, and got my headphones on, got in touch with our gun pits, and one of the boys on the ship was on gun pit 42 over on the port side, up forward on the bow, and he kept trying to say something and couldn't say it. And finally we realized why he couldn't, because the boy in the gun pit on 43 on the other side of the ship opposite him said, "There it goes." What it was a torpedo coming toward our ship, and this boy was
You could see
standing there watching it coming right at him, and he was just staring death on the face. But the thing was set at probably 15 feet deep, and our ship was generally about 13 feet deep on the forward and 15 foot aft. And so if it had hit us midship, it would have probably gotten us. But it went under us through the bow, and men were all over the water by that time, and we were trying to pick them up, and we started the zigzag pattern. But that was one of the most, one of the times in which we came closest to being in very real trouble. One of the other times was when the Japanese aircraft came in over our ship. We were beached in the northern Philippines, and he came in, or a Japanese Betty, twin-engine bomber, came over us, and again, I was gunnery officer, and time I got up to the conning tower and got in touch with the gun pits, that he came over us in just a great big gray mass just flying a few feet above us. And he dropped his bomb when he was over us, but the momentum of it carried out forward of us, and tremendous explosion just in front of the ship, and the nose cone fell over on the main deck of our ship. I used it as a paperweight for a long time.
The nose cone of the bomb?
Nose cone, the cone of the bomb. And but I was very much aware. When we would go into an action, I would always say, "Lord, you know I'm not very much, but remember my folks are praying for me." And I believe their prayers were answered. When Japanese surrendered this very month, 48 years ago, about, I believe, the 14th of August, and an emergency leave came through for me. And I managed to get home after a long trip across the Pacific by air. And my mother was dying of leukemia. She apparently was trying to hang on to life until I could get home. I gave her last transfusion. And of course, her health was so deteriorated at that time, it didn't help. She died 2 weeks after I got home. And that was in November of 1945, September of 1949. I was reassigned to another ship. We traversed, it was LSD 601, and we would go in and out of the country. And on one of the trips in, I called down to Ellen and her parents and asked them to come up so we could be married. We were married in the First Baptist Church in Norfolk, Virginia, in November of 1945, with Dr. John W. Kinchlow officiating. We had an empty church full of flowers and a few sailor boys, but we had a formal wedding. And it was a marvelous time in our lives. I was released from active duty to inactive duty. And after the war, Ellen and I lived in Slidell, and I worked with her father. I managed our concrete block plant and helped build the new furniture store that her daddy owned. And it was located right there in the heart of Slidell Business District at that time on Carey Street. Ellen was carrying Jim at that time, and we were eagerly waiting the birth of our firstborn child. And after Jim was born and the store building was completed, Ellen designed this house here, and I started the process of building it. And shortly after we moved into the house, I became greatly concerned, though, to discover whether or not the Lord was calling me into ministry. And our dear friend, M.H. Field, who is now ill in Jackson, Mississippi, was our pastor then. That was in 48 and 49. And he prayed and counseled with me many long hours. On one occasion, a very bright young seminary student came out to preach a series of youth meetings, youth sermons for us in a youth revival. And he also spent a good bit of time talking with me about knowing about God's call and responding to God's call. His name was Landrum Benson Level, and none other than our president, the nephew of our then seminary president, Dr. Roland Q. Level. But after many concerted prayer efforts, on one occasion I came out of the walk-in locker that is right behind us here, and where I've been going every morning and getting on my knees in the dark and praying and asking for God to let me know. I walked out of that room one morning, stood in the hallway just behind this door, and realized that God was calling me into ministry, and felt a great sense of release and relief to realize that he was. I enrolled in the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary in January of 1949. In April, I was called as pastor, of all things, to the First Baptist Church of Mandeville, Louisiana. It was a struggling church at that time, less than 50 active members. The town had deteriorated, gone down. The church was struggling, and they let me be their pastor. Ellen and I were living on the $70 a month that they paid me, plus the $90 a month, which my GI Bill educational grant amounted to. So, believe it or not, we had enough, and we were doing well. But if it had not been for the loving and generous and abundant help of James and Jessie Champagne, Ellen's parents, I'm not sure that we could have lived anything like as comfortably or even survived as we did during that time and during the next 7.5 years while I was in seminary. They helped us tremendously and did it joyfully. In October of 1950, I was called as a state missionary to be pastor of the First Baptist Church, or rather it was the mission. At that time, it was a mission, Baptist mission on Grand Isle, in the very southernmost settlement in Louisiana, on an island in the Gulf of Mexico. And during my 7.5 school years that I was there, I would commute 300 miles round trip there and back, and then 300 more miles from here to school on weekdays. And the truth of the matter is, I used up 5 cars during that time and traveled a distance equal to 9 times around the world at the equator. And Minton became the First Baptist Church of Grand Isle in 1953, and I continued as their pastor on up to January the 1st of 1958. During those years, I was able to invite the whole seminary faculty down for an overnight fishing trip on a boat which belonged to one of my church members who was working with the On the Wall Company. And they would come at least on 2 occasions. We would go out to a red snapper bank and fish. I remember how much Dr. J. Watts, who was so formal and such a gentlemanly person, how he relaxed and enjoyed catching those giant red snappers on those occasions. In 1952, while we were still on the old campus, Dr. Level asked Wilbur Schwartz to investigate the possibility of starting a radio program for the seminary. And Wilbur mentioned it to me. I was his undergraduate assistant, or his aide, student aide, what they called us at that time. And he mentioned it to me, and I went downtown and did some investigating. And out of that effort, we got a tape recorder. That's when tape first replaced wire. Up until that time, I had owned a wire recorder, but I got a tape recorder, and we started producing the seminary radio program, Faith for Life. I had the joy of naming it, and Wilbur, in his own sweet way, would permit me to write the scripts and to record the dialogue, the sermons, and the music, and then edit the tapes. And I did that for 5 years then. You remember the time?
I do. How many shows? Y'all did a lot of shows.
Oh, yeah. You remember the times during summer when we would tape some things right here at the house. But Wilbur would permit me to do that, of course, under his supervision and under his responsibility. By the way, I didn't think I was doing enough at that time. I was pastoring at the Grand Isle, and I was his aide, producing the seminary radio program. And so there were a number of radio programs that kept asking people to send money. And I wanted to have something on the air that said, please do not send any money. And so we started a program called The Bible Speaks from the First Baptist Church of Grand Isle, Louisiana. And for several weeks, we had it on the air daily. And we would sign off with, please do not send your money. This program is a gift to you from the people of the First Baptist Church of Grand Isle, Louisiana.
Did anybody ever send any money?
No one ever sent us any money.
They took you at your word.
We had to go off the air. Those were exciting days. In 1953, the seminary awarded me the old Bachelor of Divinity degree, which was the result of 3 years of studying, and which is now called our Master of Divinity program. And I've since swapped the BD for the Master of Divinity. In 1954, they let me have the Master of Religious Education degree and permitted me to enter the Doctor of Education program, which had not been instituted completely at that time, but they permitted me to enroll at Southwestern, transfer the credit back to New Orleans, and then graduate with the first of the DRE degrees in 1957. And after graduation, I was called to Baptist Sunday School Board as editor of Family Life Curriculum. Home Life magazine, we all know and revere and love, appreciate, was at that time, our one family publication. And the need for broader family emphasis and more curriculum material was evident. And so I had been hired to formulate a program with regard to curriculum development and family life education. Ellen, the children, and I moved to Nashville, bought a home on Davidson Road in the Brook Hollow subdivision. And as far as we knew, we were there for life. We hadn't given much thought to leaving at all. My task mainly was one of research and planning curriculum materials, and was certainly an enjoyable, kind of challenging task. In the summer of 1960, after I had submitted the program proposals there for family life curriculum, I received 2 phone calls within 24 hours. One was from Southwestern Seminary and the other from New Orleans Seminary. Both were invitations to consider leaving the board and coming to their school. I was overwhelmed, of course, by the prospects at both schools, and entered into a period of concerted prayer and effort to try to discover the direction the Lord would have us go. I learned a very great deal about prayer at that time. One of the things I learned was that willingness to go whichever way the Lord leads you is apparently one of the factors that contributes to knowing what God wants you to do. But I began to have a sense of direction, and I know now, as I look back, more than I knew then, of course, that it was the Lord's will, and even more do I know it now, 33 years later, that the Lord intended for us to come back to the New Orleans Seminary. One of the events that confirmed that a short time after I came back to New Orleans, instead of going to Southwestern, was that Dr. Don Bell had left as professor at Southwestern to go to become the vice president of one of the Texas Baptist colleges. And several months after he went, he called back to Dr. Heacock and said, "Dr. Heacock, I believe that I've made a mistake and I want to come back to the seminary." If I had been there, I don't know that he could have come back, but he did, and had a continued fruitful ministry there, he and John Drinkford, in the psychology work at Southwestern. But I've recently written to Dr. Heacock and have reminded him of the conferences that we had, and reminded him that I've been here at our school for some 33 years. He's up in age now, but he's still the gentleman that he always was, and apparently in good health. My new work at New Orleans Seminary was entitled Dean of Seminary Services, and also Assistant Professor of Psychology. The area of responsibility had to do with student counseling, lending students money, alumni affairs, enlistment, and secular and church work recommending. Quite a handful, along with the teaching of the seminars in psychology and counseling. We developed a wonderful staff of some 7 people, and we're soon lending as much as $100,000 to our students, helping them borrow it through student loan programs. And at the end of the second year, we lost count of the number of recommendations we'd made, but when we lost count, it was over 6,000. And we were just in the second year of the work. In 1963, Dr. John Price, who had been my major professor, came to me and said, "Don," said, "you know, we've got youth education with Jack Watson. We've got childhood ed with Mildred Sauer. Wouldn't you like to start some adult education work?" And I said, "Dr. Price, I don't know much about it, but I would like to give it a try if I don't have to leave what I'm doing." He said, "Well, I'll talk to the president." So he talked to the president, and the president said, "Yeah, let him do it." So for the next 10 or 12 years, I had both jobs. I was Dean of Seminary Services and Professor of Adult Education. Had the joy of developing that program about as far as I could carry it, including the study of adult psychology, adult education, and family life education. Those were the 3 main areas that we dealt with. And so for about 10 years, I had both of those jobs. Of course, just for the same salary base, of course.
Right.
But the two jobs. But that didn't bother me. Believe it or not, we have always had, our family's always had more than we needed. And it seemed like the Lord was providing even before we would ask. But to our deep sorrow, in 1963, Ellen's mother, Jessie Jones Champagne, died of a heart attack. And Ellen began to help her father in the store. He died in 1966, and Ellen inherited the business. And from 1966 until 1987, she and later Donnell participated in the running of the business. They converted it into a clothing store. Ellen was able to supplement our income greatly during those years. For the entire period of the 33 years, though, I commuted from Slidell to New Orleans and back on school days. January of 1972 at 48, I had a severe heart attack. Shortly after that time, and until August of 1978, I had only the one task. That is, professor of adult education. But there again, I had carried it about as far as I could go. And along about that time, a marvelous young minister came along named Ferris Jordan, whom I love dearly. Such a gentleman, such a Christian gentleman. And Ferris became the head of that work and carried the work even further. He did further study in the field of gerontology and developed a whole further curriculum for that area and did a magnificent job with it up until the recent past. In 1978, Dean Kennedy, J. Hardee Kennedy, and Dr. Level asked me to begin a new work as academic counselor and director of testing. This work was of significant magnitude that I no longer taught classes. It included giving psychological tests to all entering students and personality readouts and to all who requested it, and special tests were given to persons, problem persons making application to the school and to persons entering the various doctoral programs. Such testing, of course, led to many very fruitful personal counseling opportunities. We had responsibility for handling all of the student requests, and of course that opened up the possibility of dealing with students on the basis of their problems with regard to coming to school or staying in school. We also edited for about 13 years the seminary bulletin and enjoyed doing it a great deal. The volume of the traffic in the office was surprising to me. My secretary, of course, had to keep records of all of our contacts. I had one red wingback chair, which I think you used after
I did
that in your office. That easy chair, before the second year of our work ended, 1,500 people had sat in that chair. I should say, the chair was used 1,500 times. Several people used it several times.
More than once.
More than once.
Right.
Since my overall task was to help as many students as I could, and because all I had to do was sit there and try to help them, many of them began to try to bring things, to give me items that they knew I'd be interested in. And before long, my office became a little bit like what some would call a museum, in which could be found a giant wasp nest in the upper corner of the end of this room, 2 6-foot rattlesnake hides, A table covered with fossil mammoth bones, shark's teeth, a cave bear's tooth, fossil horse teeth. There was another table and 4 large shelves of arrowheads, arrow points, spear points, and other Indian artifacts. One trustee sent me several beautiful points from North Carolina. Lovely points. On the floor could be found a bear skin and a deer hide, cannonballs, a multitude of rocks from the Holy Land that students who'd gone over to see Israel brought back to me. From the very beginning, I felt like I had the best job on campus due to the enjoyable, in-depth relationships that I was able to have with so many of our people. Sooner or later, I had some contact with everybody who went through during that, 13 years of time. 14 years, I guess. At this point, I'd like to read a summary statement which grew out of a question which Dr. Paul Robertson asked me recently. He said, Don, I'd like for you to write me a note about your most memorable experience in the seminary. And out of that thinking, I came to realize how many memorable moments I'd had, and I began to try to cull through all of them and list a few of them. And what I want to do is read for you a statement about most memorable moments at the seminary for me. And there's some repetition here, but I'm doing that for emphasis because of the significance of these things for me. Would you want to stop for a moment at this point? Let me catch my breath. One reason I want to read this is because in it I'm able to mention a large number of the people, students and faculty that have meant so much to me through the years. And I want to read it so that I can get it all in a short period of time. And so in writing to Paul, I said that the past 43 years of my seminary experience as a student, as a professor, and a counselor have provided many memorable moments. The first was in the fall of 1949 when I walked through the gates on the old campus and Dr. Ian Patterson, professor of preaching, took the time to talk with me and to confirm that I was indeed having a legitimate call experience to ministry. And another was when Dr. Wilbur Schwartz asked me to become his aide and later his graduate fellow. The experience of helping him with the seminary radio program, which I mentioned earlier, was the most fruitful experience for me. From 1950 forward, the often outlandish, and I mean outlandish, fellowship with such fellows as Landrum Level and John Gibson and Irving Cheney and Malcolm Talbert and Wayne Barton and Bill Bolton, M.H. Fields, Henry Anderson, Cotton Causey, Gray Allison, and others made the whole business of studying and pastoring a whole lot easier. I missed mentioning Bob Wilson, who could pull a joke. He'd stay up all night to pull a joke at 5 o'clock in the morning on Sunday. The awesome experience of listening to men like J. Wash Watts, Old Testament scholar par excellence, Dr. Roland Q. Level, whose love for evangelism, for winning people, was widely known. J. Hart-E. Kennedy, the Old Testament Field. Penrose Sanama, who was perhaps the most frequent preacher on our seminary radio program, Frank Stagg. Listening and trying to learn from these men was an awesome experience for me, and sometimes frightening. Getting to know and become friends with outstanding scholars like John Price Jr., Kelvin Moore, Stanley Jack Watson, John Durst, from whom I heard recently. He's still alive in South Carolina. Ray Frank Robbins. All such interaction was awesomely inspiring for me. Born in 1950, when I'd been told at the hospital that I could go on to school because Ellen was going to deliver, but it may be many hours before the baby would come. I went on to school, but that morning, Martha Haney came and got me out of class and said, "Boy, get down to the Baptist hospital. You're about to become a papa again." That was when our baby girl, Donnell, was born, March the 11th, 1950. That was a big experience. The night that the whole faculty sat in on my doctoral oral examination was one of the most thrilling experiences of my life. I'll never forget, I could hardly believe that after 7.5 years and 2 masters and over 250,000 miles of traveling, that I had actually earned a doctorate. And to tell you the truth, I was so excited and so thrilled that night that I didn't wait for them to come by and congratulate me. I went around thanking all of them for passing me.
Everybody on the faculty came back?
Everybody on the faculty was there. I don't believe that since that time that I've ever been both as intellectually alert and as emotionally keyed up at the same time as I was that night. The Lord just was with me, and I realized it, and it was a joyful experience, one of the most joyful experiences of my life. Of course, leaving the Sunday School Board in 1960, coming back to the seminary as Dean of Seminary Services was like coming home for me. I'd always felt a strong sense of respect for and identity with the seminary. It was never just a place like any other school for me. It was like home and family from the very beginning. And throughout my 33 years of ministry at the seminary, I, of course, felt many emotions, many emotions. Some fear when called upon unexpectedly to perform, or unprepared, or when I was unprepared. But mostly I felt joy and a great sense of satisfaction, particularly when I was able to help some struggling student to gain an insight or to overcome his discouragement and find solution to some of his problems. I think I learned more from them than they learned from me. I'll never forget the pride I felt men who majored with me in their doctoral work. Such outstanding young ministers as Cos Davis, Jim Chavis, Bob Marsh, Bob Mouse, Gerald Love, Nathan Bowles, Bill Patterson, Carl Dickinson. See, my son Jim was interviewed and approved to become a member of the faculty. It was a tremendous moment for me. his continued study, he's now earned another master's degree and has actually, in his growth and development, completed the requirements for a second doctorate. And in the near future, will receive that. He would be, by the way, the fourth person in the history of our school who has earned 4 doctorates. The other 3 that earned 2 doctorates. The only other 3 men I know are Harold Rutledge, Jack Watson, and Ray Frank Robbins. But you'll be the 4th to earn 2 doctorates. And that's a thrill. Perhaps the most awesome experience of my life came suddenly on January the 2nd, 1972. In the midst of a heart attack, I had a death experience, or near-death experience, which I left my body. Jim was present. I was awestruck in the presence of the Lord. And I caught a glimpse of heaven before he sent me back. Because he did send me back, I can look back now with great joy at a most blessed life from the vantage point of 70 years. I can look back with great satisfaction on the fellowship of dozens of my present colleagues, my colleagues and fellow professors. I think about the joy of working with men like Landon Level and Bart Neal and Paul Gregoire and Danny Chisholm and Mike and Gail Parrish and Lee Glisclair, Joe Coppin, Billy Smith, Tay Corbin, Hilma McQueen, Debbie Moore, Chuck Kelly, and the dozens of others who were there and who were in many ways sacrificially serving the Lord, but following His calling there at our seminary. I think about my former secretaries, among whom were such wonderful people as Gail Parrish, Vaughn Wilcox for 7 years, Rachel Crocker, who put her husband Lamar through, Donna Wigley, you remember Donna Wigley?
Remember Donna?
Ann Broughton, who found a husband while she was in school, and I think they became missionaries later. Judy Knoll, who was 21 in 1960 and my secretary, called me not too many years ago. She's a grandmother now. Surprised because the image I had still of a young 21-year-old girl. I think of the many, many wonderful experiences that I've had with literally thousands of students. I got to know them in a way in this work in the last few years, an in-depth way, more than I guess I could have known them as students in a classroom. But the totality of my study and my life experience confirms to me that the Bible is true, and that Jehovah God is our Father, and that Christ Jesus is our Lord and Savior, and the Holy Spirit is our ever-present comforter and guide. And the goal of life, in my estimation, is to accept Christ as Savior, to discover His will, and to do it as His Spirit leads. I thank you.